Good afternoon and welcome to another Asia Society event. I hope you all are keeping well and safe. Today is our first in the Disruptive Asia series in 2020, and we'll be discussing Asia's economic growth and the path to a low carbon future. My name is Thomas Sohn and I'm the Executive Director at Asia Society Australia and curator of our Disruptive Asia 2020 edition. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm currently on Gadigal land. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge all traditional owners and to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or First Nation people joining our webcast today. We are very excited to be bringing you the Sustainability Special Edition of Disruptive Asia to life with the first of a live series of discussions. Disruptive Asia is a major thought leadership initiative by Asia Society that looks at how Asia's rise is impacting Australia's foreign policy, economy, and society, and how Australia should respond. In 2020, we ask if Asia's rise is sustainable, environmentally, economically, and socially. As Australia, Asia, and the world is facing the worst pandemic in over 100 years, we can't lose sight of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this year, at the dawn of a new decade, and with only 10 years to deliver the 2030 agenda, we will bring you some of the best minds from Australia, the region, and across the globe to analyse and debate key sustainability issues at a time when Asia's rise is having profound impacts on our society, our economy, and the environment. Today, I will be joined by a panel of sustainability experts, all Disruptive Asia contributors, to discuss the prospects of a low-carbon future in Asia. I will introduce our panel in a moment, but let me quickly go through some housekeeping. We hope that today's session can be as interactive as possible on an online platform like today. The panel discussion will run for approximately 25 minutes, and we will then move to Q&A from you, the audience. As we go along, please feel free to submit your questions and comments through the live chat box at any time, located to the right of the YouTube live video. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Joining us today from the UK at a very early hour is Director of Asia Pacific Sustainability at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Alistair Ritchie. Al leads and oversees activities on Asian carbon market development and the Policy Institute's overall sustainability portfolio. He's an international expert in greenhouse gas emissions trading systems with over 25 years of experience in climate change, energy and air pollution control strategy and policy, including in China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Lynette Molyneaux is the Advanced Queensland Research Fellow at the Centre of Policy Future at the University of Queensland, working with the state government to understand the sensitivity of the Queensland economy to energy shocks and to develop contingency plans to prepare for a global energy transition. And Sophia Hamblin, Chief Operating Officer at Mineral Carbonation International, is one of the few female executives leading the international development of carbon capture and utilization. Driven by a passion for sustainability, the environment and technology, her leadership in Australia-led climate solutions continues to attract national and international attention. Great to see you all and a very warm welcome. Sophia, I might come to you first, and some initial reflections on COVID-19 and the impact it's having on the sustainability agenda. As huge amount of money are being directed to the recovery efforts, and rightly so. The UN and certain world leaders have come out and made calls for a COVID-19 recovery that is aligned with delivering on our Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goal commitments. How do you think sustainability will fare as Australia and the region is tackling the current pandemic? Are we likely to see a reduction or stagnation in climate action and finance, or can it help build momentum and indeed accelerate efforts?
Thank you, Thomas. As the world has collectively come together to fight COVID-19, and as we see different efforts succeeding in Australia in particular, I think that we've really got an opportunity to rebuild and use the disruption to business as usual to create a more sustainable future. So I agree with the notion that we should be rebuilding with sustainability principles in at front of mind. We, as humankind, have collectively paused and really thought about the kind of future we want to have and the kind of lives we want to lead. I really believe that post-COVID, the capital and the finance that will emerge out of this will be more ethical and more sustainability focused than before. And I think that efforts will be, if anything, ramped up.
Well, that's good to hear, a positive outlook there. And this is something we might come back to later in the discussion. A central theme for Disruptive Asia this year, Asia's recent economic rise is quite simply remarkable. It's the world's fastest developing region and will continue to be for some time. The question we have to ask ourselves, though, and I might put this to you, Al, is there a way to sustain economic growth at this level and at the same time lower the region's greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. In short, the answer is yes, there is a way. I think that the major opportunities in Asia are to transform the energy sector by shifting away from coal towards gas and ultimately renewable energy. Renewable energy is becoming increasingly competitive with coal. The transition also requires reducing energy demand through pricing electricity and improving energy efficiency. And it also requires support to investment in radical decarbonisation technology for industry. So in terms of how all this can be achieved, it requires a good framework of renewable energy infrastructure and policy. It requires policies that can encourage greenhouse gas reductions where they're cheapest, and policies that are business friendly and that do not lead to carbon leakage. And the key challenge is to do a detailed economic analysis of not only individual policies, but also the mix of policies across different sectors of the economy. But yes, it's definitely possible. It's already been proven in the EU. And in fact, perhaps the real question is, and the real challenge is, the only way to achieve economic growth is to reduce GHG emissions, because if you're not reducing GHG emissions, you're exposed to significant economic threats in the future. So I think it's a critical issue.
Well, it's a very good point. And again, one will come back to later in the discussion. Lynette, let me now come to you in your update for Disruptive Asia this year on Australia's export boom in Asia. Asia's future economic growth will have huge demand for increased energy supply. And Australia is well placed to provide it, as we know. However, currently that comes primarily in the form of fossil fuels. You argue that there's a real opportunity for Australia to continue to supply Asia with energy products, but from renewable sources that promote sustainable development. What are these alternatives in your view, and how do you see a shift in the energy exports to Asia evolve?
Thank you for that, Thomas. The opportunities for Australia are remarkable, based on the fact that we have the most fantastic renewable energy resources around the globe. We have a very large landmass, we have marvelous solar and wind resources, and we have proximity to Asia, which is extremely useful. The advantage of particularly solar is that it's a technology where the costs have decreased dramatically over the last 10 years. And in fact, the projections are that the solar energy, electricity generated from solar energy, will continue to decline another 40% over the next 4 to 5 years. And coupled with that, we all know that solar energy is not isn't really a deal for in the middle of the night, but there are opportunities for energy storage. In Australia, we can use pump storage to be able to time shift from when the sun is shining to when the sun isn't shining. And equally, there is lithium-ion battery storage, which allows you to be able to deal with the intermittency of solar energy as a cloud scuds across the sky, and you need to actually be able to make up for what's not there. Benefit with lithium-ion battery costs is that they too have decreased by 85% over the last 10 years and are also projected to decrease by another 40 to 50% over the next 4 to 5 years. So what we're seeing is a massive reduction in the costs of generating electricity from solar and wind and in batteries. And this gives us the perfect opportunity to be able to use those resources in 4 different ways. Either we can generate the electricity in Australia in its current as just electricity and ship it via cables across to Asia, which is what a company called Sun Cable is already under plan to do. That's a fantastic opportunity because they're going to actually go via Indonesia on the way and drop off a bit of electricity there and then end up in Singapore, which actually kind of suits that purpose. The second opportunity we have is to actually use our solar and wind energy to be able to generate hydrogen. And then on that basis, we can ship the hydrogen across to Asia and the rest of the world. And Japan and Europe are taking a lead on the whole use of projecting a future onto hydrogen, specifically in the reduction of iron ore for the purposes of steel making. So that opportunity is fantastic. The third opportunity is to actually use cheap renewable energies in Australia to be able to generate, to manufacture primary metals really cost effectively. Aluminium is a case in point, and aluminium requires cheap electricity because it's its largest cost input. And that's why smelters are generally located close to very cheap energy, specifically in places where there's a lot of hydroelectricity in Canada, in Russia, in Iceland for its geothermal. So it's located in places where there's lots of really cheap renewable energy. And the way to be able to keep aluminium manufacturing in Australia is basically to transition away from its fossil fuel-based source of energy to its to a renewable energy form. And then the final way is actually basically to do manufacturing ourselves in Australia, but specifically target that fantastic global opportunity which is underway in Europe and China to be able to move towards electrification of the transport industry, specifically passenger vehicles. And to do that, what you need is lithium-ion batteries. And with lithium-ion batteries, we have a huge proportion of the minerals required in Australia. So we can actually extract right here, manufacture right here, and then ship energy storage to the rest of the world. So we have all these fantastic opportunities over the next 5 to 10 years, and we should be leaping at them.
Mm. That's a very good overview there. I just wanted to follow up with another question, if I may, on, as you would be aware, 11 of our 15 largest trading partners are in Asia, and many obviously import coal and iron ore. So how do you see what potential countries or markets, so to speak, do you see among those trading partners where renewable energy can really become a cornerstone of our trading relationship?
I mean, it's kind of interesting because there are three options really for us. The first option is that the hydrogen option, whichever way we transport it, it can either be through some medium or through hydrogen itself. But the reality is that Japan has taken a lead. Its strategy is to develop opportunities for hydrogen across the board in Japan, but specifically also in the manufacture of the reduction of iron ore for the purposes of steel making. So that's the first major opportunity. And I think there's quite a lot of projects already ongoing looking at that specifically for Australia. And that is interesting because Japan is an old partner with Queensland in particular in terms of its support for coal mining, into thermal and metallurgical. So they're an old partner and they're now shifting to something new. The other opportunities are in places like Korea and China to the same extent. Both South Korea and China are hugely focused on the opportunity for motor vehicles. South Korea in particular is investing a huge amount of capacity into manufacturing, not only in South Korea, but also across the world. And they're going to need energy storage, lithium-ion batteries specifically. So we are a perfect place to be able to locate the energy storage for the purposes of rolling out to these huge markets for energy electric vehicles in both China and Europe as an opportunity. So it's a fantastic opportunity that we should be climbing onto as hard as possible we can now.
Thanks, Lynette. I wanted us to stay a bit on I guess, investment opportunities and new markets in sustainable finance and decarbonisation. And I might come back to you, Sophia. Your company, Mineral Carbonation International, has come up with a solution to industry that does not require a price on carbon offsets or subsidies. How does this work?
Thank you, Thomas. And I just wanted to say, Lynette, I really enjoyed your essay. It clearly sets out a lot of really exciting opportunities for Australia to take advantage of the Asian market and vice versa. My company, Mineral Carbonation International, transforms carbon dioxide into building materials and other industrial products. So what we do is we take carbon dioxide emissions from industry, the steel and cement industry, emitters, and even sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we turn them into materials like cements and plasterboards, and really utilize the waste stream into a new product. And we argue that that is another really exciting, similar opportunity to what Lynette has outlined. We can be utilizing Australia's key competencies in bulk handling and in advanced manufacturing, and taking emissions from our emissions intensive industries that need a pathway to decarbonisation and turn them into green building products, things like the cement brick, which is what we make at Mineral Carbonation International, but also other products. CO2 can be used as a feedstock or as an ingredient in synthetic fuels, as a chemical feedstock, and that can be used to make other building materials. So some of the work that I'm doing is working in advocacy, particularly for in a company called CO2 Value Australia, which advocates that if we treat carbon dioxide as a resource, we can unlock unlimited innovation potential and access to finance so that Australia can become a carbon processing hub. We can lead the world and help our trading partners, especially in Asia, have a pathway to decarbonisation.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to your paper as well.
Yes.
In our series due to come out next month. Thank you, Sophia, on that. I wanted to come back now to carbon pricing and to Al. You put this forward as, it's a key instrument that is emerging in Asia to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and major Asian economies are really pursuing emission trading systems, or ETS, to meet national mitigation targets. And as you say in your paper, the regional frontrunner is the Republic of Korea, while China is now on the verge of launching their own national system. How significant do you see these developments? And beyond addressing climate change, how important are the ETS to Seoul and Beijing in forging a cleaner and more dynamic modern economy?
Thank you, Thomas. So if we start with Korea, so the significance of the Korean emissions trading system is that it's the front runner in Asia, as you mentioned. It's a successful emissions trading system. It's been operating for 5 years now. And really, I feel that if an emissions trading system can work in Korea with a very energy intensive industry sector, a high reliance on exports, so it has to be very competitive, its industry, and also has government controlled electricity pricing. So if ETS can work in Korea, it can work anywhere, and it's been shown to be successful. It had a challenging start. It was attacked by industry, but it's now accepted as a core policy for the government to achieve its 2030 NDC target. So it's a successful policy, and it's a great reference to other countries. So in terms of China, the significance is that when the national emissions trading system starts for the power sector, it's going to be immediately the world's largest emissions trading system. It will then expand to other industry sectors. It will become a dominant player in the regional and global carbon market. And it also has some features that are quite attractive to developing countries. So interestingly, the allocation system provides flexibility to handle economic shocks. So the COVID-19 shock is something that the China ETS can handle quite well. In terms of their importance to the economy, interestingly, one of the main motivations for China to adopt an emissions trading system was to use it as a tool to transform their manufacturing industry to encourage more higher value, lower energy intensive industries. And in both cases, the ETS is a valuable tool to generate funds for low carbon technology and industry. So industry sectors to meet net zero by 2050 have to radically transform. And we've heard from Lynette and Sophia about some of the examples of the big technologies, but an ETS can provide the funds for that. It can collect auction revenue, and it can distribute billions of euros of funds to support these technologies. So it's very important for economic development as well as GHG reduction.
And just staying with you, Al, we're talking about what they're doing, some of the domestic progress Korea and China are making, but also promising signs of regional interest to cooperate on carbon emissions. So what can you say, what are the extent that, China, Korea and other major economies in Asia, like Japan, for instance, are looking to cooperate in this space, and how can really linking carbon markets work to reduce emissions?
Okay, so the cooperation between China, Japan and Korea has been going for about 4 years at a policy level. China is also cooperating with ASEAN countries like Thailand. Thailand's developing its ETS. Korea will also this year start a Korea-ASEAN cooperation on carbon markets. ADB is working in this field. Also, Asia Society Policy Institute this year is establishing a dialogue facility of ETS design experts across Asia to support the effective and efficient development of emissions trading systems, to encourage consistency and best practice. So there's increasing amounts of development going on, and it's very important that there is a sharing across the region, because the challenges in Asia are often unique to Asia. So there's a limit, there's diminishing returns to which you can have EU to Asia exchange. That's already happened a lot. So I think the big opportunity now is across the Asia Pacific region to deal with the challenges of like government controlled electricity markets and so on. In terms of the purpose of this cooperation, a key goal is to achieve best practice, consistency, harmonization of design, to enable industry to have a more level playing field and to encourage better policy. But you mentioned in your question about linking, so that's a longer term goal, and it's a common sense benefit. The benefit of linking is that as your market gets bigger in size, you have more installations, and the cost effectiveness of your market improves because your marginal abatement cost curve is a much bigger cost curve, and you can achieve lower cost reduction. So the ultimate benefit of linking is to enable countries to achieve more ambitious reduction targets at the same cost. So there's a huge benefit, but it does require political will as well. So, but the intermediate step that I mentioned is a valuable step in itself. So there's definitely a need for consistency and sharing best practice and learning from each other.
Thank you, Al. I should just mention there's a little bit of background noise to your microphone. Might be your tie. We'll see how we go for the rest of that discussion. I just want to come back to Lynette and a bit closer to home before we go to some audience questions. And please have your questions ready. The Australian government released last week the Technology Investment Roadmap discussion paper. That quote will bring a strategic and system-wide view to future investments in low emissions technologies. And in February this year, the King Review outlined ways in which Australia can lower its emissions while supporting the economy. In your paper, you argue for better policy and technology frameworks to reduce emissions. So what's your take on these recent policy initiatives from the Australian government? Is it a step in the right direction?
Yes, thanks, Thomas. In my paper, I argue for better policy mechanisms pretty much at the global level. Effectively, what has happened is that we've seen a massive increase in trade for China as a result of its participation in the World Trade Organization and its trade relationship with the rest of the world. It's been fantastic, but it's actually been at a massive increase in carbon dioxide emissions as well. And my argument in the article is more to say that we've used trade to deliver enormous economic development benefits across Asia, but we should be equally using trade now to be able to reduce the huge buildup of additional carbon emissions over the next 10 to 15 years. It's sort of pointing to the fact that Europe has indicated that it is now seriously considering a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will seek to protect industries in Europe which have introduced measures to reduce carbon emissions so that they are protected from imports from countries that have chosen not to reduce emissions and therefore have embedded carbon in their product. So there is this mechanism that is underway or is under plan at the moment for Europe, and on that basis we may well see a trading mechanism more geared towards sustainable development rather than just development per se. Now, how that applies to Australia, it's of course pertinent to Australia because Australia should be showing its credentials in this area. The King Review was an interesting look at our previously emissions reduction fund, which I think most economists would probably refer to as the 10th best mechanism that we could use for reducing carbon emissions. But nonetheless, it sought to look for administrative benefits and in fact did point to a number of mechanisms or parts of the emissions reduction fund, now renamed the Climate Solutions Fund, to be able to make it more effective. But the two telling points about the King Review was the pointing to the increase in or the addition of carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and utilization storage in the new mechanism. And whilst I think the whole idea of having the carbon capture and utilization mechanism is extremely good for the work that Sophia is doing in terms of basically allowing coal-fired power stations to stay open for longer, it might not be as positive as it could be. And in fact, Australia has spent a lot of money on CCS already, and we have pretty little to show for it. So there is there are two versions of CCS that we should be considering. The one is creating products that are useful. It's the reuse of product, and the other is trying to just hide the carbon dioxide that comes out of power stations so that we don't have to worry about it. The second, of course, is the change in the remit for ARENA and the CEFC to be able to support non-renewable energy transition technologies. Now, I mean, these are not necessarily bad things, because the technology investment roadmap has come out and basically now features CCS and nuclear energy. And it's not that I have an issue with nuclear energy, except that both CCS just for power generation, for the storing of emissions from power generation, is expensive, as is nuclear energy. It may interest you to know that across the world since 1978, OECD countries have had public investment in energy technologies has been heavily skewed towards nuclear already. 52% of everything that has been spent on energy by public institutions has been spent on nuclear energy, and yet we still don't have fusion, and we have a hot climate warming fast with a need to be able to cool, which may present a problem for nuclear technologies in the future. So we just need to be a little bit cautious about a technology roadmap, which includes a variety of things, it's good, diversity is good, but let's not focus too much on one or two of the more favored technologies. Let's consider the broad spectrum and proceed with the fantastic opportunities that we have with renewable energies and firmed renewable energies before putting those to the side and concentrating on the bigger, more centralized forms of energy again.
Thank you. I might also just go to Sophia and I know you would have looked at this roadmap with keen interest from your company's point of view as well. So just some quick observations from you as well on the roadmap.
Thank you. And I can't agree with Lynette more. Again, we definitely need to talk afterwards. The roadmap, it does include quite a lot of CCS, CCUS, and carbon mineralization pathways. And I think that it does provide a good path forward to show different solutions that can be used. But Lynette hit the nail on the head. We can't just be supporting any one or two technologies. We absolutely need to be supporting a portfolio of solutions in order to meet our 1.5 degree targets. We need to be focusing on what can be scaled, what can it help us to decarbonize quicker, and how we can really work together in a portfolio of solutions. So those are my basic, the same can be said for the King report as well. So it's a really good first start, and it's going to open up a very lively discussion in Australian industry. And I look forward to the next few weeks of that.
Thank you very much. I might go to some audience questions now. There's quite a few coming through, and many are looking, I think, on the energy mix and our carbon future. And one question coming from one of our Gen A's, our youth leaders circle at Asia Society, is what role would natural gas play in a net zero carbon future, or the role of biogas or biomethane? Maybe that's a question back to you, Sophia.
So the different energy mixes definitely all need to have decarbonisation pathways. So natural gas and any of the fossil energy sources, at the moment, the pathways to decarbonisation are reliant upon CCS and CCU, and there's a little bit of definition that needs to be sorted out there, because carbon capture utilization is different to carbon capture and storage. They're complementary but different. So there is a role to play for natural gas and biogas and the like, but any energy mix, I think, needs to be very clear about their decarbonisation pathway and clear about how they're going to help the transition to 100% renewables and the way that the industry will look like in 2030 and beyond.
Another question coming through, and I'll put this to you, Lynette. You mentioned it just before, and this comes with, there's been some difference of opinion around nuclear energy. What place does or should nuclear energy have in energy transition to net zero emissions? Particularly, there's a future for nuclear energy in Australia.
Nuclear energy is a fraught topic, specifically in Australia, and has been for many decades. The reality is that nuclear energy has been effective at generating energy in the USA. It's deployed in China. It's deployed in Russia. The concerns that I have with nuclear energy are kind of a bit more technical or sort of different to that. The first is that if we are migrating towards a society or to an electricity system that is primarily reliant on intermittent or variable renewable energy, what you need is something that is incredibly flexible to stand next to that. So on the basis that gas is incredibly flexible and can fill in the gaps, or lithium-ion battery storage can fill in the gaps when the cloud scuds across the sky or the wind drops or whatever happens. Those are perfectly suited to each other because ultimately you can fill the gaps and continue to generate electricity when you need it. The problem with trying to actually coordinate that with nuclear energy is not designed to do that at all. Nuclear energy is designed to scud away doing what it was always intended to do, with little flexibility in shifting and ramping electricity up and down. So what you're trying to do, if we actually move towards a more renewable energy, is combine it with something that takes you back to a more inflexible energy supply, which makes it incredibly complex, even more complex than attempting to do that with some form of storage and electricity generation from renewables. And my other question I have around nuclear energy in Australia is really the fact that nuclear energy is also to a large extent reliant on cooling to be able to make sure that it can keep the process going. And if we are in Australia on a warming continent and we need to cool the nuclear reactor, and how do we keep the water cool enough to be able to do so? Because already what you have in Europe is that when it's particularly hot in France, you have to basically dial down the nuclear generators and import all the wind and solar from Germany, because ultimately they can't cool the nuclear power stations in France to be able to continue to run them at the capacity they want them to do. So we are particularly vulnerable to hot future situations, particularly from the climate. And the second point is that where do you locate them where they're safe from fire?
Thank you, Lynette. Yeah, it's a tricky one and one that will continue to be debated for sure. We're coming to the end of our Q&A, but I wanted to change tact a little bit and come to you, Al, as far as you can comment on this. Obviously, you're involved, as you said, in the China ETS development, and we're very much aware, certainly here in Australia, but also in Europe, where you are at the moment, the US-China tensions and I guess the geopolitical competition that is ongoing. Do you think, will these tensions, do you think this will have the potential to lead to any unraveling of the global efforts to address climate change and the sustainability agenda more broadly? What's your view from, being very, I guess, involved certainly with China's ETS and I might have seen it from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think the US-China tension is obviously a very complex issue. But it's a time-dependent issue. It will come and go. It'll depend on the US presidential election. There's various factors. So I think that the reality is that the transition to low carbon economy is accepted by all serious nations, and disregarding US-China issues, China is committed to moving towards a sustainable development future. So I don't think it would really impact on their policy. I think that in all Asian countries, their number one focus should be the national GHG reduction. So there's a lot that each country needs to do within their own borders to get themselves on the right path to net zero by 2050. I really don't think the US-China problems will affect the seriousness of the key economies to make this transition. We heard recently about South Korea's ramped up its 2050 long-term strategy to become net zero. But yes, these are obviously huge factors that affect the short-term political aspects and maybe economic as well. But I don't think it will affect the climate ambition and the pathways the countries are following.
Well, thank you. I think that's a positive outlook, which I think I'm very happy to draw our discussion to an end. We almost out of time. There were more questions from our live audience, and thank you for those. Unfortunately, we can't address them in this session. But really, I would like to thank Al, Lynette, and Sophia for your insights. Very rich discussion today on some very important topics. And as I said, 45 minutes doesn't give it quite justice. But thank you again for the time to share your expertise and your perspectives. Finally, thank you to all of you, our viewers and listeners, for joining us today, for your engagement and questions. I hope you enjoyed today's event as much as I did. If you want to go deeper in some of these topics, do head to our website where you can find all the essays in the Sustainability Special Edition of Disruptive Asia. Our next Disruptive Asia event is on the 25th of June, so about a month away from now. And we'll be looking at tech innovations for a food secure Asia, with our speakers joining us from the US, Singapore, and China. I hope to see you all again then. Stay well and keep safe, and bye for now.